Hello, and welcome to Gateway House's special segment, Unfolding Geopolitics, where we dissect issues of global importance and assess their implications. I am Manjeet Kripalani, your host. This year, the United Nations turns 80. Longevity means survival, but for the UN, it's also a time to seriously assess its performance and outcomes. In today's episode, we will discuss the multiple dimensions of the UN's contribution and relevance to the world on its 80th anniversary. To tell us about this, we have a very special guest who is uniquely positioned to discuss this subject, Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj, who recently retired as the permanent representative of India to the UN. She is the first woman to assume this position. Ruchira has other firsts to her credit too: India's first woman chief of protocol and ambassador of India to Bhutan. It is an achievement. Ruchira has spent 37 years in the Foreign Service and has served across the breadth of missions, including envoy to Bhutan, South Africa, and UNESCO. Ruchira, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Manjeet. It's such a pleasure to be here, and greetings also to your audience.
Thank you. I'm going to jump right into this, Ruchira. The UN has received a rather unexpected birthday announcement this year, and that is the withdrawal of the US from one of its key coordinating authorities on health, the WHO, allegedly for mishandling of COVID-19. This will have a serious impact on global healthcare. It also means the US will not be at the WHO table in the next board meeting in February. What does this mean for the WHO and the UN, given that the US has been the top donor in the two-year budget ending 2023 with over $1.3 billion?
Yeah, thank you, Manjeet, for that question. Yes, you're absolutely right. The US has withdrawn from the WHO. Now, your question, what are the implications or likely implications? Well, China could potentially increase its influence within the WHO and global health governance. The US, you're absolutely right, has historically been one of the largest WHO donors. And so if funding is cut, China could step into that gap, fill the financial gap. Now, this would naturally increase Beijing's ability to influence global health policies. And China could also likely expand its Health Silk Road initiative to strengthen its ties with developing countries that previously might have relied on US support. And finally, increased Chinese representation potentially in WHO leadership positions. Also, one or two questions could be asked. How will the withdrawal create a shift in global leadership dynamics, enhancing China's role in global health? And is this a rejection of multilateralism and its mutual obligations?
These are absolutely critical and very important questions. And so, in short, Ruchira, you're saying the very reason that the US has withdrawn, which is China, might actually defeat itself, this decision. So
all you know, and let's wait and watch. Of course, the WHO representative has noted that they hope that the United States might reconsider. So let's wait and see, because I think the practical implementation of this announcement would take effect 1 year later. So there is time yet.
Okay. So that's we can take some heart from that. With full-blown conflicts going on in the Ukraine and West Asia, is it open season for the UN? Because all kinds of experts are decrying this institution. Can you please tell us some of the positives of the UN's contribution to the world today?
Yeah, well, I think you used the word very well, open season. Yes, there are many who are saying that multilateralism is dying, if not already dead, and many have written the obituary, so to speak, of the United Nations. And I think to some extent it is quite natural and understandable, because if the United Nations Security Council fails to keep the peace, then that is almost synonymous with the failure of the United Nations. However, there are some credits to the United Nations. Many of them, I would say, look at United Nations peacekeeping, where incidentally India has been a major contributor. Also look at the various successes of the United Nations in the sector of health. If you look at chickenpox, and the excellent work that's being done in polio eradication. And then, of course, the various efforts of the United Nations in terms of humanitarian assistance also, and with refugees. So there are many areas where the UN has been very effective. And I would also draw your attention to the fact that for the small states, and this is a large constituency, 108 small states, of which 38 are small island developing states, for them, the United Nations is a very effective, a very vital platform to raise their voices and concerns, issues that might otherwise be overlooked in the cacophony of noises that is also the United Nations. And they have as much of a place in the United Nations as does any other country, which is large. That is one country, one vote. So I would say that the UN has worked very effectively in the past. There have been many instances. I've only scratched the tip of the iceberg. But certainly, I think when you look at the raging conflicts across the globe today, more than 100 as we are told, I think it's quite understandable for people to say that the United Nations is failing.
Well, this is a good way to segue to our next question, which is, as you've pointed out, the UN has really seen quite remarkable changes in the world and in itself over the past 80 years. But many of its core structural and procedural elements remain the same. So while you were there, Ruchira, and obviously you're part of the entire network, is there some talk of reassessments or audits underway of the UN's operational framework, especially with regard to two elements? One is to the representation and participation of emerging global powers like India, possibly in the UNSC, and regions such as Africa and Latin America. And second, in light of the rise of several alternate structures and plurilateral groupings like the G20 and the Quad and BRICS, etc.
Yeah, well, you know, the UN from time to time undertakes audits to enhance its operational effectiveness. I remember in the year 2000, there was a very important UN report called the Brahimi Report, which came up actually with very good recommendations on making peacekeeping more effective. Then in 2004, there was the Kofi Annan Report on Threats, Challenges, and Change, which in effect suggested, amongst many other things, that the United Nations Security Council should be reformed and expanded to include both permanent and non-permanent members. In fact, I recall there were two models put forth by this report. Model A, which called for an expansion in both categories, and Model B, which called for an expansion in non-permanent categories only. And then more recently, in more recent times, there have been several reports, the most notable being the report in 2022, New Agenda for Peace. No doubt, because of the new conflicts that had emerged, notably the Ukraine conflict in 2022. So there have been efforts by the UN to reinvent itself, to make itself more relevant to the times, a UN 2.0, so to speak. As far as the representation of countries like India in new structures within the United Nations Security Council is concerned, I think a lot has been done. I myself have drawn your attention to previous reports that have called for an expansion and a reform. And I would say that the current Secretary General also has been very vocal in this regard. So all of that is happening. It is another matter that while the reports are happening, the actual reform has not yet happened that we're all waiting for. That is the way forward.
And what will provoke that reform? Because India is now waiting. There is the G4, there's Germany, Japan, Brazil. The whole world is just waiting. Is there going to be a trigger? Because we've got two wars and there's still no trigger.
Yes, that's right. I think that's a good question. I mean, normally people assume that when there is a war or when things turn upside down, and heaven knows a lot has turned upside down in recent times, including the COVID pandemic, but the desired reform hasn't happened. Well, the short answer to that would be that the process is very complicated and it potentially impacts the existing balance of power.
Yes.
So it might not be the easiest of things to happen, but you never know when the next trigger is round the corner. Let's leave it at that.
And my last question is really on India. Well, my second last question. India has not had a significant headquarters of any UN agency in 80 years. The West dominates this, and even little Turkmenistan has a headquarters of a UN agency. Our BIMSTEC neighbor, Thailand, has ESCAP. Why is that, and what can we do to remedy to reflect our emerging influence in the world?
No, absolutely, Manjeet. I would say it's a very good question, but I have some good news. There are two UN bodies that are headquartered in India. The first is the WHO Southeast Asia Regional Office that is based in Delhi and in fact covers 11 countries. So that's excellent. And the other one is the more recent WHO Global Center on Traditional Medicine, which is headquartered in Jamnagar. And as far as I know, this center is already operational. There are several projects that are underway, including data analytics, AI-based solutions, and systematic reviews of traditional medicine practices. So there you are.
So it's all focused on healthcare. And
for the moment, yes.
That's interesting. And even with the headquarters of the UN, how does that add to India's influence in the UN?
Yes, you mean having centers?
Yes, yes.
Certainly, certainly. Everything adds to the big picture.
But we don't really use it. India doesn't use its influence because we could make the world lean one way or the other, but we don't.
Well, we're on our way, and I would like to tell you something that I've personally experienced through two postings at the United Nations. The voice of India at the UN is heard with a lot of respect. We are a voice of principle, a voice of reason. We are also seen as bridge builders. We have contributed across the entire spectrum of the agenda of the United Nations, which is very vast, from peace and security to development to human rights, and now digital governance, including artificial intelligence. And we have been 8-time members of the United Nations Security Council, where we contributed very positively and actively in the most recent tenure to all of the United Nations various mandates. So overall, I think our influence is quite considerable. India is one of the leading voices of the Global South, a country that, as I've already said, contributes across the full spectrum of the United Nations activities, and a country that is recognized and acknowledged as such, bringing today solutions to the global top table.
Yes. And about the other giant in Asia, China. China is finally on China. The US is in totality the largest funder to the UN at contributing to 22% of its budget, and China is next at 15%, followed by Japan at 8.5%, Germany and UK at 6%. With the US expressing frustration with the UN, China is only too willing to step in. And it already has, as our study from 2021 shows. How can India counter this influence of China in the UN system?
Well, I would say we play our own game. Now, you know, we have a wonderful past in the early years of the United Nations. All of you would recall that India contributed immensely to the decolonization agenda of the United Nations. As far as South Africa is concerned, one of the countries where I also served as ambassador, India was the very first country you would recall to inscribe apartheid on the agenda of the United Nations. And over the years, India has continued with that developing agenda, because the bulk of countries in the United Nations are developing countries, and our leadership with the South is acknowledged. I would draw your attention to the fact that very recently, when India extended a helping hand to many countries of the South during the course of the COVID pandemic, many senior officials in the United Nations, and including many ministers from many countries, publicly acknowledged India's contribution, the altruism that was displayed by India during the course of the pandemic. And that's just one instance. There have been so many other occasions when India has stood its own ground and taken forward the agenda in its own way. And that, you would recall, was spelled out very clearly by the Prime Minister of India when we were hosting the G20 summit, when he said that everything is interconnected. So one earth, one family, one future. And I think India is walking that walk and talking that talk, and today is seen very positively by countries at the United Nations as a country that is caring, that is contributing very positively to the greater global good.
Thank you, Ruchira. So the UN is really made up of the goodness of its neighbors, of its members, and glad to know in 80 years, India has played a very positive role, and we hope an even greater role to keep the world in balance.
Indeed, indeed. I'm very hopeful and very positive.
Ruchira, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, likewise.
And we wish the UN a very happy 80th birthday.
Thank you. I think it could do with that.